Hi guys, this is Erisa. Welcome back to my Fire Emblem 6 No Hard Mode bonus characters run. Now chapter 16X is not exactly the most interesting chapter to watch, so I figured I'd try to make the video a little bit more interesting by adding some commentary. I can't exactly hope to compare to Don or Horace's Insight, but I figured it was worth a shot anyway. So to start off, what you probably noticed already at the start of the map, I burned an RN with Roy. Now, this isn't really strictly necessary in order to return the map, but pretty much everything else in the strategy simply fell into place after I did it, so I ended up being a little bit lazy and simply going for it. Right now, you'll see both Percival and Alan actually get to use a couple of stat boosters. The speedwing on Alan is actually a little bit interesting because I was actually having to save my two speedwings, one for Nime and potentially one for Igrene. Igrene actually procced 2 speed on the last chapter, so the speedwing was no longer necessary, but she needs 2 speed over her base in order to double the Sage directly to her north with a longbow. This Sage can actually one-shot Lalem on the next turn. Even with a barrier boost, she is one-hit KO'd. Now, if I had managed to get an angelic robe on her in previous chapters and a barrier boost, then she would be perfectly safe. However, due to her nature as a dancer, I simply haven't had any spare turns in order to which to use an angelic robe on her. Whilst I could have simply rigged a dodge on Lalem, I prefer to try to avoid as much rigging as possible. Sol had to face a 30% displayed hit rate from the enemy silence user. Now, the silence user would typically prioritize Cecilia, but she does not currently have a staff in her inventory. This is important because enemy AI in Fire Emblem 6 will only attempt to silence enemies who have a staff rank and have a staff in their inventory, meaning that Sol will always be prioritized over Cecilia in this situation. Shout out to Don for that piece of information. This is useful because it allows me to simply KO the enemy bolting sage with Cecilia's own bolting, instead of having to waste a turn using restore. I could have chipped with bolting on the first turn, but Cecilia has a niche in being able to one-round KO the enemy knights to the north, which helps to reduce the enemy density. She does not need any special weapons to do so due to being a magic user. Note that Cecilia's class, which is the Valkyrie, also gains boosted EXP, which means that she's actually one of the very few units who's still gaining decent EXP off these unpromoted enemies. Cecilia is actually a heavily underrated unit in this game by many players, especially when it comes to her combat. She is often pigeonholed into the position of a pure staff bot, which is rather unfair. Whilst her base stats aren't very impressive, she is more than enough to get the job done. When compared to her direct competitor in mounted staff and magic users in Clarine, her base magic is higher than even a 21 promoted Clarine. Her growth in the stat is also better, meaning she can maintain this lead. Her low skill is offset by her great growth in the stat, along with the high accuracy of animatomes in this game. Her defensive bulk is practically double what Clarine can ever expect to have without having stat boosters thrown on her. Whilst it's true that Clarine has a significant lead in speed and luck, Clarine is actually one-shot or nearly one-hit KO'd by a large amount of enemies, whereas Cecilia can actually take a hit. Clarine's speed lead is also unimportant for combat, because Cecilia's base speed is enough to actually double the only enemy type she really needs to, which are knights. Her higher magic and weapon rank means she'll always be doing more damage than Clarine here. The other enemy type that magic is useful against are wyverns. Cecilia does not need to double here, because she comes with an A rank in Anima, which allows her to use air caliber at base, which she handily brings with her too. This does triple damage to flyers, giving her a whopping 35 might versus flyers at base, which is enough to do tons of damage even without doubling. Clarine has no chance of ever reaching A rank in Anima, due to how long it takes to raise weapon ranks in Fire Emblem 6, and because she starts in E and has a worse magic stat, she cannot even offset the damage gap via doubling using stronger tomes. This is ignoring the fact that Cecilia does not require a getting ring to be promoted in the first place, and that we want to dump as much EXP into Sol as possible early on, because he's the ideal user of the warp staff until Nime arrives. However, I don't want to spend the whole video ranting about Cecilia, and we're almost out of time. I also have one last thing to point out. If Diek had exactly one more strength or the boss had one less defense, then he could one-shot him with a single crit here. However, unfortunately, he needs to connect 2 hits and crit on at least one of them, which is rather unlikely. Fortunately though, everything falls into place once everyone has taken their turn, and then Roy seizes on turn 3.